On today's bonus episode of the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast, I have MathBomb himself, Mr. Relative Athletic Score, Kent Lee Platte. He is joining the show to talk about and explain the RAS, how to value the RAS, and talk about some of the past RAS outliers for the NFL draft, because the draft is almost here. So we're going to talk about this and more coming up next.
You are Locked On NFL Draft, your daily podcast covering the NFL Draft. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Locked On family? Welcome back to the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast, your daily podcast covering your favorite draft prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your boy, Damian Parson, always on the ones and twos. You can find and follow me on X at DP_NFL. I'm a national scout and a senior draft analyst. And guys, thank you for making Locked On NFL Draft your first listen today and every day. Shout out for being our everydayers. Guys, we have a fun bonus show for you. Like I said, Kent Lee Platte, a.k.a. MathBomb himself, is joining the show with me in just a little bit to go over the RAS that we all use every draft season, the Relative Athletic Score. He's going to explain it. He's going to talk about how to value it. I'm going to talk about past RAS outliers. We're going to get into all of that and more coming up next. But before that, guys, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. All right, guys, we have a special guest on the show. Listen, you know him every draft season as MathBomb on Twitter, or as we call it now because of Elon Musk, X. Kent Lee Platte, Mr. RAS Score himself, guys. Kent, thank you for coming on the show, bro.
Appreciate you having me, man.
No, for sure. Talk to us, man. Like, how did you really get? Let's kind of get into like the backstory first of how did you get started? Collecting the RAS scores and making your graphics and really pushing it to the people to help educate the people, and then after that, explain to people what the RAS score is.
Yeah, so RAS is relative athletic scores. The R does most of the heavy lifting in that acronym. The idea behind it started in 2013, which was the Le'Veon Bell draft. Not just because of Le'Veon Bell, but he was a pretty significant part of it. The issue that I had with it at the time was that he ran a 4.6 in his 40. And a lot of people were saying, "Oh, well, he's just not athletic enough to go early in the NFL. We shouldn't draft him. He's not athletic." But it was really the only thing that he stunk at was the 40. And even then, for a back his size, a 4.6 ain't even that bad. Like it wasn't even that critical. But that was the whole argument, was he was unathletic. And I started listening to all those other superlatives that we get at the time. A guy is quick but not fast, or a guy is explosive, or a guy is agile, or even a speed merchant and stuff like that. We have all these terms that we use, but it didn't really mean anything other than just a term that you could throw on somebody.
Yeah.
And I started trying to think of a way that I could make it a little bit easier to understand, provide some of that context behind the testing. So RAS was developed to be easy to understand. It's not meant to be some be-all, end-all. It's just a way to contextualize the metrics a little better. What it does is it compares a player's testing to their position group from 1987 to the player's draft year. So there's a hard cutoff on the player's draft year so that we can track it, because otherwise it would always be changing, right? Anytime you add a new player, it would change. Again, that R doing all that heavy lifting. But the idea was just to make something easy to understand. The cards have always been stoplight color coded, red, yellow, and green, because everybody kind of understands red, yellow, and green. The individual numbers are basically percentile, but I wanted to do a 0 to 10 because it kind of started that way, with an easy way to understand something. Everybody can understand a 0 to 10. If somebody says 0 to 10, 0 is not good.
Absolutely.
And then that, by definition, 10 becomes the good one. It was all about trying to make things simpler. And then once I got the metric in and I started building up the database, we started finding some of those trends where, first round draft picks tend to be the higher rated guys. NFL players that find success tend to be those higher rated guys. So we started seeing the trends and stuff a little bit later. It always started as just a way to contextualize metrics better.
No, and I love that because of the fact that, we talked about it off air. Film, studying film is such a big part of evaluating, but it's not the only part. You need some of them, we need these metrics, the data points, the historical data, things to kind of compare it to. I'm a big believer in, and Kim, I'm a big believer in, like, all right, let's look at the numbers and let's see and match it up with the tape, right? Like, so you have a lot of different data sites, right? The PFF, the Sports Info Solutions, different things of that nature. And I'll literally go and look at, like, some of the data points from, say, a game for a cornerback, on PFF. And I'm like, all right, and say he gave up 100 yards. Let's go back to the tape. And I always use the two to marry them together, right? So it's like it's all about painting a picture, and you can't paint a picture without all of the tools. Without the tool, without the paintbrush, without the paint or the canvas, you can't paint a picture. And I'm a big believer in that, man. Just being able to use everything. Like, am I a big analytics guy? Not necessarily. I'm getting more and more into analytics when it comes down to scouting and everything. For my job and just for me, I'm very much not a complacent individual. I want to grow and continue to elevate my game. So, like, I'm always looking to evolve and just, like, looking at these different things. I'm like, man, listen, at the end of the day, if someone went through the hard-earned time to put this information together, all right, let me check it out. Let's see what it is. Let's put it to good use, and let's allow it to help me, put some more context to the film. Let film put more context to the data, different things like that. And you brought up Le'Veon Bell, and I remember that draft. Like, people really were down on him because the 4.6 and thinking like, oh, man, and I love the fact you use the terms like quicker than fast, because that was always his game. He played at his own speed, his own pace, and it was never going to be, hey, I'm going to win a foot race in the 100-meter dash. It's, I'm very quick, I'm patient, I can get to my spots when I need to get to them, I can follow my blocks, and I can get to daylight. Am I going to have a bunch of 50-yard runs? Maybe not, but I'm going to be very effective in what I do.
Yeah, and it is just marrying what you see on tape. Probably 95% of the time, the way a guy tests is exactly what he looks like on film. We talk about the guys that people really have a difference between, but those are few and far in between. Generally, if a guy runs a really good 40, he looks fast on tape. Mm-hmm. And when a guy tests differently, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but when a guy tests differently than what you see on tape, you have to ask yourself two questions, and you have to ask them in order. The first question is, are the numbers wrong? Not are they wrong as in that's not what he ran, but in that, is there any context behind it? I sent you a couple of examples, but like Xavier Howard and I forget who the other corner was. But we had a couple of cornerbacks that had tested really poorly at the combine, and then Joe Hayden was the other one. Tested poorly at the combine, and then they went out at their pro day and tested out extremely well. You go back and look, they were both hurt at the combine, and I know Hayden specifically was dealing with some preparation issues with his coaching, so he just wasn't ready to do the tests, and he was hurt at the time. So you end up with poorer numbers. They both went to their pro days, had ridiculous numbers at their pro days. You're talking about guys that would have been just below 5 on RAS, but when they went to their pro days, they were both in the high 8s, low 9s, like a huge jump in their testing. You also have guys where that just isn't how they win on tape. My favorite example to use is always Anquan Bolden. Anquan Bolden isn't going to outrun anybody. He isn't super explosive as a runner. He's definitely not quick. That's never been his thing. But if ball's in the air, it's his football. You have to fight him for that football, and you're usually going to lose. And he had such a great talent to box defenders out with his body and use that physicality to really – none of that stuff's measured in the tests that we do. So if the numbers are wrong, it isn't, oh, they're just incorrect. It's usually that's not what I'm looking at. I'm looking at it incorrectly. I'm not trying to find a guy who has all these great numbers if that's not how he wins. Amon-Ra St. Brown has been an excellent player for the Lions, and he had a pretty good RAS. It wasn't an elite one, it was a pretty good. But he ran a 4.62, I want to say it was, or 4.64, and it didn't matter. That isn't how he won. He didn't win because he was a speed merchant. He was just really good at getting open. He was very explosive. He was able to create that separation and just get a couple of yards so that he could catch the football. If that's what you see on tape and the numbers generally align with that, great. That second question you have to ask yourself is, am I wrong? Because if you're watching a guy and you think he's really explosive, really, really athletic, and then he tests really poorly, the question should be at some point, am I just wrong about this guy? One of my favorite things to bring up with people, I will never miss as hard as I did on Eric Flowers, who I loved on tape. I loved his tape. I loved a lot of stuff he put together. He tested poorly, and ultimately that's how he played, was poorly.
Yeah.
And you go back to it after the fact and you look back and say, what was I wrong about? And in that case, I was just putting way too much value on the stuff he did after he got off the line, where he was taking out like corners and safeties and linebackers, guys who were never going to beat him, one-on-one.
Yeah.
But you go to the line and he's just getting eaten alive when defenders really get into his face. But I was paying attention to the other stuff. It's fun. It's fun to watch that stuff. So those are the two main things: is does it match the tape, and are the numbers wrong, and then am I wrong? You have to make sure you pay attention to those two things. And if you look at those questions and you still come out with negatives, that doesn't mean you write off the player. You can't just be like, oh well, the numbers are bad, or I'm wrong, or whatever, and I'm done with it. Because there's also what situation are they coming into? Going back to Amon-Ra St. Brown again, Amon-Ra St. Brown wasn't a first round pick; it wasn't a second round pick. But he was he landed in a very good situation for the type of player that he was. The type of receiver that Amon-Ra St. Brown was, where he'd create that separation and get those little openings. That was perfect for Jared Goff. It was perfect for Ben Johnson's offense. It just worked for what they were trying to do. Those marriages between a player's style and where they land is very, very important. It can't be understated just how important that kind of stuff is. So you want to pay attention to the numbers and try to see if they match what you're seeing on tape. And you got to pay attention to where you think they're going to go. It's all important.
That's a good point. And listen, we're going to continue to keep this conversation going to the next segment, man. We're going to talk about, like you said, valuing the RAS. And is it the end all be all? You said it is not, but just wanting to educate our listeners and the NFL draft fans on how to use this tool. We're going to talk about that and more coming up next. Say goodbye to busted brackets, because FanDuel lets you bet on every single game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a number one seed, it's time to go dancing, guys, on America's number one sports book. Right now, new customers get $200 back in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines, so much more. You can even pick who you believe is going to win it all. I want to repeat that for you, though. That's $200, guys, to use on point spreads, money lines, so much more. And you can even pick who is going to win it all. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Again, just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Kent, I loved how you threw out those two questions. If the numbers don't match what you see on tape, you got to ask yourself two questions. Are the numbers wrong or am I wrong? And that's a process that we do from a straight film evaluation. That's what for the combine. And I've been one who, like, I enjoy the combine. I love the combine, right? Like, I try to explain I tweet out every year, guys, don't lose your minds if someone does run slower than you expected, because you may have valued his speed a little bit more than it actually is. I've done that before, where a guy goes into the combine, I'm thinking he's going to hit 4.2, 4.3, and he hits 4.5, and I'm like, oh, didn't expect that. You know what I mean? So and then also, like, it's just a tough thing, because you look at the 40-yard dash and how these guys are running. That's not a normal NFL play itself, because you're in the track stance at the line with no starting actual block, like actual track and sprinters. And you watch the Olympics this summer, they're going to have a block behind them, guys, so they can fire off. It's a lot easier that way. You know what I mean? But they don't have that, and it's not something that you see outside of, like, defensive line, like edge rushers, stuff like that. Those guys getting 2 and 3 and even 4-point stance, and that's normal for them. But it's just a little different. So it's like I always say, man, don't lose your minds if someone runs slower or faster. It's always meant to take you back to the tape to either confirm or readjust. So for you, man, like, kind of explain to the people, when it comes down to RAS, relative athletic score, how should they value it in their own scouting and evaluation process.
One of the things that I bring up to people every year is that most of the prospects in this draft class are going to fail in every draft class.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say that, people think, oh, they think of the drafts. They're looking at 250 to 300 players, and you're thinking most of those guys fail. It's not like that. There's over 2,500 players in this draft, and almost none of them are going to get drafted. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
1 out of every 10 are going to get drafted each year, if that. And of those draft picks, a very small percentage of them are going to actually succeed. I did a study a little while ago talking about the relative hit rates for different positions, and 1 out of every 5 receivers taken in the first round is going to hit, is going to become a Pro Bowler or a 1,000-yard receiver. 1 out of 5. 4 out of 5 aren't. And that's a heavy burden when your team takes a wide receiver in the first round, knowing that most wide receivers are going to fail.
Mm-hmm.
It's different for every position, and people value things differently. But generally, NFL prospects fail. So when you see all these different guys with high RAS, most of those high RAS guys are going to fail too. You can't look at it as high RAS equals success, and same thing with low RAS equals failure. The idea is trying to find what that probability is. So from a tracking perspective, we can look at things in reverse. We can look at things the other way around. We look at players that are successful, and we try to find what are the types of guys that fall into that category, which is where I get all the numbers when I talk about the success rates for different RAS and stuff. I'm talking about the players who we know are successful. How did they test? Because you want to try to find guys that are similar to players who are successful anyway. Not everybody's a unicorn. Most people aren't. So you want to try to find a player that has been successful and compare them to a player that you really like, or the other way around usually. So if you have a guy that you like and you compare them to another player who wins similarly in the NFL, one way that you can use a tool like RAS, more so now since we have the compare tool that we added last year, you can look at them side by side with players who play similarly. Note, I'm not talking about the numbers yet. I'm just talking about play styles. They play similarly.
Yeah.
And if you look at those guys and the numbers are similar, now you know that they have the same type of athletic traits as somebody who's already been successful in the NFL. And you can see, that makes sense that they would look similar to that guy. A few years ago, my Lions drafted Kerryon Johnson. Kerryon Johnson had a very similar type of running style, that quick one-cut burst through the line that Marshawn Lynch had. And they're very much not the same players, but he had that one trait that he excelled at that I knew Marshawn Lynch excelled at. You put them side by side, they were very similar testers. They had some of the same athletic traits. It's the same thing with guys who test poorly, but this is where I think people kind of lose how to use a comparison. Is you're not looking for a guy who failed similarly. If a player runs slow, you're not looking for another slow guy. You're looking for, and I'll use Keon Coleman as an example. He did test very well other than his 40, but using Keon Coleman as an example, he ran a 4.62, I want to say. You don't look for another 4.62 guy and say, oh, well, this is this other 4.62 guy, because he's not Cooper Kupp, who ran in the 4.6s. He's not Amon-Ra St. Brown, who ran in the 4.6s. The 40 times the same, but those are very different players. They don't play a similar game. But if you look at Keon Coleman and you think of a guy who has that same kind of physique and the same type of go up and get it type of play style, you find guys that play similar to him. And maybe you find somebody like Nuck Hopkins, who didn't test very well, but does have at least a similar play style. Not exact, but you're at least a lot closer to how they play. Mm-hmm. So you can start to see, does the speed aspect inhibit his ability to play? And do I think that that's going to be the same thing for Keon Coleman?
And it's crazy that you brought up Keon Coleman, because I literally just pulled him up as a point of reference, because like you said, he tested very well in everything for the most part outside of the 40, right? Like he had a good, a good 10-yard split at 1.54, which I think Xavier Worthy was in somewhere in that range of 1.51 to 1.54, somewhere in the 10-yard split. He ran a 4.21, but like the 38-inch vert, 10.7 broad, all the rest of his jumps and everything was explosive. And I remember, talking to my co-host and my colleague over at the Draft Network, Keith Sanchez. There was two names that came to mind when we talked about Keon Coleman from a play style standpoint. It was Brandon Marshall, who played for the Broncos and the Bears, and then we thought about Dez Bryant. And I pulled up Dez, and Dez's RAS was like a 9.06. Both had a 38-inch vert. Dez had a longer broad. and Dez was a little bit fat. He was like, a little bit faster in the 40, he had a 4.52 with a 1.53 10-yard split. I think Dez actually was heavier too from looking. I think it was like 224 when he came out. Yeah, he was he was a little bit heavier, about 10 pounds heavier than Keon was at the combine. But their play styles are so similar where, yes, you're not going to get a bunch of foot races won, a lot of explosive verticality to their game. It's more so quick, short area quickness, body positioning, body control, physicality, playing at the catch point, being a possession receiver. And I think that's why, like, when I watch so many people just like, oh, I'm out on Keon, and I'm like, okay, so you expected him to run a 4.3? Like, that was probably not the expectation to have when you watch his play style.
Yeah, exactly. You have a guy like that, and they run a 4.6. That is checking a box. It's not a good time for a receiver, but all you needed for it was for him to not run a 4.7 or a 4.8 or something.
Correct.
You didn't need him to run some ridiculous time. You don't need him to outperform expectations. You just need him to at least come close. They didn't have to hit expectations. If you expected him to run a 4.55 and he runs a 4.61, that's probably okay. Like, yeah, that's the same general range. But if you expect him to run in the 4.3s and he doesn't, that's your fault usually. Mm-hmm. We had this last year with Brian Branch, and we had it, I think it was the previous year with Traylon Burks, where people kind of expected them to blow it up. Yeah. And I'm using those because, as me tooting my own horn, those are both guys that I didn't think were going to test super well, and then they kind of didn't. And I was the fact that people were surprised was what surprised me, right? But in both of those instances, that doesn't make them bad prospects at all. It just means that they're not winning because of those specific athletic traits. Traylon Burks uses that, where you were talking about body control, and his ability to box out guys the way we talked about with Anquan Bolden, like he did. He used that kind of thing to win. The fact that he wasn't a burner wasn't that big of a deal. It didn't really matter all that much. And Coleman is the same way. It does not matter that he's not a burner. You're not gonna, if you're asking him to run streaks every play, that's your fault as a play caller. That's
correct. I think that's the part that, when you look at some of these guys, like I said, that's why I wanted to get you on, man, to kind of go over this, because I love how you, like you mentioned, put play style to play style, and not so much RAS to RAS, or he ran the 4.64, so I'm gonna find another 4.64 guy that looks just like him. No, like, how do they play? How do they win? And that's a big part of my evaluation process. I always ask, where does a prospect win? Where does he lose? And then when the RAS comes out, and I'm like, okay, well, long speed was a concern I had. I see that showed up in his 40-yard dash, and things of that nature. That's why when you talk about Keon Coleman and Dez Bryant, those guys weren't winning a ton of foot races, but that 1.54, 1.53 10-yard split shows that quick area burst and quickness, that short area burst and quickness, where they come off, they can fire off the ball off the line of scrimmage, and they can win quickly. It's more so, hey, they're not going to beat you vertically a lot, and if they do, it's going to be more so playing at the catch point, or we call playing basketball above the rim, catching the alley-oops or the back shoulder fades, and you feel really good about that. But man, I want to keep this conversation going even further. We're going to talk about some of the past outliers, right? The Kyrie, we talking about, last year or 2 years ago, Kyron Williams, Puka Nakulas. There's a lot of different guys that have tested or not have great RAS scores and went on to have success in the NFL. So we're going to get your take on that coming up next. As always, guys, thank you for making Locked On NFL Draft your first listen today and every day. Shout out for being our everydayers, man. Finishing up this RAS conversation with the man, the myth, the legend himself, Kent Lee Platte, a.k.a. MathBomb on Twitter, or X as we call it. Past RAS outliers. I think you brought up Xavier Howard, Joe Hayden, those guys earlier. But you sent me some names. Tom Brady. Guys, I'm just going to run. I'm gonna give you the RAS score, 274. For Tom Brady, right? One of the GOATs. Calais Campbell, and I love that you put it in here as a defense, and I love that you do this anyway with prospects. The positional, like DN, D tackle, he had a 3.84 as a DN, but he had an 8 as a D tackle, right? Jarvis Landry is 0.27. When you see those, when you look at those numbers, when you see those type of numbers, and you see them all the time because you're the one who handles this stuff, like, for what goes through your mind? And like, when you look at these outliers, what does it tell you in general to kind of teach the fans?
Yeah, and I brought up those specific examples so I could show some of the different ways to look at a guy that tests poorly. Calais Campbell is not a traditional edge, and we have Darius Robinson in this draft, who's also not a traditional edge, and he tested out fine as a defensive end, better than Campbell did as an end. But you're not really going to use him as a traditional speed rusher on the end. You're going to do some outside and inside stuff with him. We have a lot of examples of guys like that. DeForest Buckner started his career out at end, eventually just moved full time inside the tackle. We have Zadarius Smith is one of my favorite ones because he's another guy that plays inside and out.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a guy that tests poorly for end, you got to understand for RAS, at least right now, all of these positions are the traditional NFL positional alignments. That's why we don't have interior offensive line. We have center and we have guard as two separate positions. We have strong safety and free safety as separate positions. We only have one defensive tackle. We don't have nose tackle yet. I am building out that functionality, hoping I keep hoping to have it by next year, but I've been saying that for the last 2 years. But the idea is that you understand what those differences are when you're looking at it. Guys like Landry, and I put Orlando Brown in there as well, guys that test just abysmally. You got to really look at why. And for Jarvis Landry, it was two things. One, he just isn't that great of an athlete. He isn't that type of guy. And two, he tested at the combine with a bad hamstring. Hamstring is not a serious injury, but it is a limiting injury. It'll limit what you do. And Landry was like, nope, I'm going to test anyway, and tested out as, for example, 5 of his 10 metrics are the worst for any Pro Bowler ever. And it's just terrible, terrible testing. It doesn't make him a terrible player. It just means that he tested really bad because he tested injured, and he wasn't that super athletic to begin with. Orlando Brown got yelled at, or not yelled at, but he got chastised at some point, at least I remember from the combine, for loafing, which I remember because somebody's like loafing. He was just sitting around. Somebody had to like correct him for that, which I always thought was funny. But then he would go on to be a multiple Pro Bowl player. And for him, it's a little bit easier because if you want to figure out why he was still successful, he has told us. He's done interviews where he talked about how he tested poorly and it didn't matter because of his play style. He uses his length, his understanding of the moves that players are going to do. He studies very intensely to find out what they're going to do so that he can have a game plan for them. He told us how he was able to kind of overcome what we would normally view as a deficiency. Then you have guys like Dalvin Cook, who tested out with a 4.65 out of 10. And that one was surprising to me at the time because his whole deal was that he was this supremely athletic, gifted running back. And he comes in with just awful agility testing and explosiveness testing, which is wild if you've ever watched him play. Right. I don't even know what the answer is for those numbers. I don't know he wasn't injured. At least there was no injury reported at the time. He didn't report any kind of illness or anything. Maybe it was preparation, but we've never really known why that happened. Yeah. Sometimes we get an answer. Darius Leonard is a really good example. He injured his, I believe it was his hamstring he injured while he was running, but he was close enough to the end that he finished the 40. Yeah. So it ended up being poorer testing because he hurt himself at the combine. Sometimes we get answers like that. Sometimes we just don't. And you just have to reconcile the fact that sometimes it's just not going to match. It's not going to look similar. Golden Tate, one of the most agile players I've ever seen play, one of the quickest players I've ever seen play, had a decent overall RAS, but his agility testing was terrible, which is shocking if you've ever watched him play for more than 2 seconds, right? Sometimes it just doesn't line up, you know? Sometimes it's a positional thing. I mentioned 4 different centers in the list that I sent you. We have both of the Pouncey brothers, Travis Frederick, Rodney Hudson, some of the best centers that have played in the last 2 decades. And all 4 of those guys tested terribly for centers. And I believe what's going on there is just that center is not necessarily, depending on your scheme, it's not necessarily an athletically dependent position. A lot of center has to do with being able to identify alignments, identify defenses, being able to understand where players are supposed to be. There's a cerebral aspect that you don't get for other positions on the line. So I believe that combined with scheme are why you see guys that don't necessarily test all that well and still find a lot of success in the NFL because they're just a different type of player. It's kind of like nose tackles. Nose tackles don't have to be quick. They don't have to be fast. No. They don't even really have to be all that explosive. They just have to be really big and really strong and generally have really good length so they can cover a lot of area. So nose tackles generally test very poorly. T'Vondre Sweat had a below average RAS in this draft class, but for a 366-pound guy, every single one of his testing numbers was eye-popping. They were all numbers that you would not expect a guy his size to be able to do. So the fact that his overall score is lower does not bother me one bit. You still have a guy who wins the same way that he wins on tape. All of those numbers show up on tape in a positive way. That's an explosive guy for 366. I think he tested 366. Huge dude. That's an explosive guy. That's a quick guy. That's a fast guy being that big. It's just, if you're looking for a guy that big, that's an athletic guy for that size. And you need to go past the numbers at that point and understand there's more to it than just what a scoring system says. Because we're comparing it to everybody, not just guys like him.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's a big part of just evaluating is in general, because like we talk about Jarvis Landry, as you said earlier, with like Anquan and Keon, don't expect them to win foot races vertically down the field. If, like you said, if you're sending these guys on go routes, 80% of their routes, you might need to be released from your job as the offensive coordinator, because you're not doing the best for yourself, for your team, for your offense, or for that player. Where we remember watching Jarvis Landry in his prime, whether it was in Miami or his time, he was healthy at Cleveland with the Browns. You run him on a lot of slants, in breakers, finding the soft spots within the zone, and then you allow him to be that tough physical player after the catch. Get yards after the catch, make plays after the catch, be a chain mover, get those first downs, that glue guy, those tough, nasty, gritty yards. He's gonna bring that. So it's like, I love that you sent me those examples, because a lot of times when people like, and it's crazy enough, I'd never seen his RAS score before. So when I saw it, when you sent it to me, I said, good Lord. Like, you know what I mean? To have that success he had with that athletic testing. But as I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, DK Metcalf, when he came out, they say he ran like a terrible 3-cone. And I remember hearing that he slipped, he didn't actually run it real smooth. But I remember telling people, I was like, listen, you see how he's built. This is a muscle-bound body and frame. I'm not asking him to run a bunch of option routes like Julian Edelman. Like, that's not what I'm about to ask him to do.
And even if you are asking him to do some of those things, he can still win at him. If you're asking him to do a quick in-breaking route, he's within 5 yards of scrimmage. He can put his hands on that corner. He can fight with that dude. So yeah, maybe he's not gonna out-quick that guy, but he can throw him in the ground.
Absolutely, brother. I appreciate the time, man. Just kind of diving in to your bag, getting your explanation, hearing it from the man himself that does this for us every single year. Kent, go ahead and just let everybody who does not know where to find you. Yeah,
as you mentioned, I'm on Twitter at MathBomb. I've been posting a lot more on other socials. I'm doing a lot on Facebook, also at MathBomb there. I think it's MathBomb RAS on Instagram and Threads. I might be wrong on that. Something similar to that. You'll find me. I use the same logo for everything. And then, of course, ras.football, ras.football is my website. You can look up. There's now 26,000 something players on there from 1987 to today. We have a compare tool to do side-by-side stuff. We've got a lot of stuff there for you to play around with. I actually also manage the Pro Football Network mock draft simulator, and we just launched a multiplayer mock draft simulator today over there. Very excited to see that and how people get into that. So lots of places you can check out my work and hopefully enjoy it.
Listen, guys, that is Kent Lee Platte, a.k.a. MathBomb, the guy that handles the RAS, the relative athletic score. Listen, you always know what we tell you guys. Thank y'all so much for joining us. And go and follow and subscribe for free on YouTube, wherever you listen to podcasts, to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. I'm Damian Parson, and you already know what to do to come and join the conversation again tomorrow on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.